Hey everybody, happy vernal equinox, and thanks for joining me on this third video of our nature observation video series. So today is the first full day of spring, and all you need to do is look around you to see that spring has definitely sprung. Even before the vernal equinox, many of the trees in the area were in bloom. Now, a lot of these trees you don't notice the flowers because they're not big and bright, but for instance, this silver maple has tiny little flowers that you need to look close to find. The forsythias are in bloom. The Bradford pears are making a show on the landscape. The camellias are in bloom. The daffodils are flowering. Many of the tiny wildflowers that you don't even have to really look hard to notice are flowering all over. And some not so wild plants like hyacinths are also in bloom. One of my favorites, the sweet violet. Henbit is all over the lawn. And even at night, the sounds of spring. Now, in this video, I'm not going to talk a lot about the science behind why it's spring. We talked a lot about that in the very first video that we did. I explained the interaction between the Earth and the Sun and why the seasons change. But there is one thing I wanted to show you. Now, one of the things I did in the first video was to show you this little experiment where we staked out on the horizon the different places that the sun's going to rise throughout the seasons. In this first picture is a picture of the sunrise the first day of winter. The second picture is a picture of the sunrise the first day of spring. And the third picture is the two combined so you can see the difference between where the sun rises at the different times of the year. And what's going to happen is the sun is eventually going to work its way to the left, more towards north, and will rise in a different place the first day of summer. So I hope you found those pictures pretty interesting. I love the whole science behind this. So this video is called Spring's Wild Harvest. And what we're going to do is we're going to go out onto the landscape and we're going to look for some wild foods. So spring, by far, is my favorite time of the year to look for wild edibles. The abundance is staggering. And the other part that's really great is a lot of the plants are freshly coming up out of the ground, which means they're young, they're succulent, they haven't gotten any bitter flavors, and most people enjoy the food this time of the year rather than later in the summer when things get tough and bitter. So this is definitely my favorite time of the year. So I do want to remind you that before we go out and collect, that there are some dangers to collecting wild edibles. It's really important that you follow safety guidelines. Now, I'm not going to go through all the guidelines here today because in the first video, the Autumn's Wild Harvest, I spent an extensive amount of time on the rules for collecting. And probably the most important thing that you need to know is to make sure that you identify your plants correctly. A lot of this takes a little bit of practice, and it's a good idea to find somebody that knows wild edibles to actually go out and teach you. You know, books are good, the internet is good, but you know, I've been on a couple of sites where people give the wrong advice. So I highly recommend that you do your research before you go out and do this. Alright then, so well, let's go out and see what we can find. Follow me. Alright guys, well, this is the first plant that I want to show you, and this plant is called purple dead nettle. This is all over people's lawns and fields. It's really prolific this time of the year. This plant is edible, and I'm going to show you a close-up of it here. You know, a lot of these ground cover plants, you need to get down to the level to see how really pretty they are. And if you look at those flowers closely, you can see they look like tiny little orchids. So this plant is edible. You could take the whole top with the flowers and you could just eat it the way it is. You could put it in salads, you could cook it up and use it any way you would use another kind of vegetable. It has a real earthy flavor, but it also has a little sweetness to it because of the flowers. Now here's another great plant that you find this time of the year. It's green and it's succulent, and this is called chickweed. Now chickweed is another one of those plants that grows in abundance in the springtime. And it's a great plant to use as the base of a salad. It's really delicious. You could eat it raw. You could actually cook it up, and I've known people, and I've tried this before, that you could actually use this as the base for pesto. And it's very nutritious, and it's a great plant to add to your diet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to collect a bunch of this and get a salad started. So the next plant that I want to talk about is actually a tree. And I'm sure most of you recognize this as a redbud. Now the part of the redbud tree that we're after are the flowers. And these flowers are actually really delicious. You can pluck them off and eat them just the way they are. I've put them in muffins, I've put them in pancakes, sprinkled them on a salad. This is a great addition to any salad because it livens up the color and it brings nutrition. So I'm also going to gather a bunch of these for our salad a little bit later. But I'm going to take a handful of these flowers, and then I'm going to show you a picture of the close-up of the flowers. And when you start to follow plants and start to understand the different families of plants, you'll notice that these flowers look a lot like anything in the pea family. And this tree is actually part of the pea family. Now this time of the year we eat the flowers, but as soon as these flowers get pollinated and the seeds come out, the little seed pods, when they're only about this big, are actually a good food. So this tree has a lot to offer. Not only is it beautiful in the springtime, but it also has lots of edible parts. The other cool thing is I'm going to show you a close-up photo of these flowers. And if you hold them in the right way, you'll see that these flowers look like little tiny hummingbirds. So here's the next plant I'd like to talk about. And even though this is not a wild plant, it's really pretty common in most people's gardens. So, of course, the next plant that I'm talking about is the tulip. Now, most people don't think of tulips as an edible plant, but they are. And the part that we're going to talk about mostly are the petals. The petals could be used as a garnish. They could be put in soups. They could just be eaten raw. Now, there are other parts of the plant that are edible, like the bulbs, but special care has to be taken on the way you eat them. Matter of fact, in World War II, in Holland, people used tulip bulbs for survival because there was no other food to eat. But they knew exactly how to cook them to take out the toxic parts. So I'm not recommending that you eat tulip bulbs, but tulip flowers or tulip petals are usually pretty good. The other thing I want to mention, that since this is a plant that doesn't normally grow around here, most people get these from nurseries. Of course, everything you buy from a nursery is full of toxic chemicals. So you need to be really careful that if you're going to use a tulip for food, that it's been grown organically and it's not been sprayed. That's really important, okay? So I'm going to collect a couple of these petals and we're going to use them in our salad. So since I mentioned tulips, I want to point out another plant that's not a native to North Carolina, but grows in abundance in a lot of people's gardens, and I have it all over my property. And this is called daylily. So daylilies are one of those plants that you really need to be cautious about collecting. There are really no distinguishing characteristics for this plant. You need to know the plant, you need to follow it through the seasons, you need to know what the flowers look like. These are not in flower now, so harvesting this could be a little dangerous because there are other plants that look just like this growing in the spring. So all I did was walk about 30 feet over to the next tree, and we have plants that for the untrained eye look very similar to the daylilies. These are iris. You don't want to eat iris, that's for sure. So again, be really careful with your identification of your plants. So it turns out that all different parts of this plant are edible, from the flowers to the leaves to the tubers. And in different places in the world, different parts of these plants are used for different things. Like for instance, in Japan, the flowers are used as actually a delicacy. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to dig up a couple of these plants just to show you what the tubers look like. Now they're not really big, but they're bulbous, and you could use these, you could eat them raw, you could put them in salads, you could saute them, you can cook them as you would potatoes. Here are a couple that are a little bit bigger, but they're not huge. They're not like the size of a potato, for instance. But you gather enough of these, it's substantial. Now, a good dish at this time of the year would be to take those tubers, clean them off, and you could actually leave them whole. Take the leaves, dice them up, put both of these in a pan, saute them up, and put it over rice with a little tamari, and that's a good meal right there. So, using this plant as an example, I think this is a good time to bring up something really important. These are called daylilies, but these are not true lilies. These are not in the genus Lilium. So common names could be deceiving, and I want you to keep that in mind because, for instance, if you went and ate a lily of the valley, you could get very sick and possibly die of a heart attack from eating those. So be sure you know your plants, learn the scientific names, and don't be deceived by people calling something a lily and thinking that it really is, okay? Now here's the next plant that I want to talk about. And if you're lucky, you'll find a patch like this where these flowers grow in abundance. And I'm sure most of you recognize that these are violets. And this is the perfect time of the year to be collecting violet flowers. So I moved over to this patch of violets because this patch has a lot more leaves and a lot bigger leaves than the other patch. And I wanted to show you an identification characteristic of these plants. First of all, the leaves are heart-shaped. And the other characteristic of the sweet violet is, you see how when the leaves are first coming out, how these top parts of the heart curl in towards the center? And if you look closely, you can see that that's the way all of these are. The new ones. Now when they get older, they flatten out into just a heart shape. So that's one of the ways of identifying. Now violet flowers are very distinct. You can't go by color because there's lots of different kind of violets, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But there are 4 petals that are in kind of an X shape, and there's one that hangs down that I like to call the tongue. So it's purple on the outside. When it gets towards the center, you get a white center, a white striped center. Now, there are so many things to talk about when it comes to the violet. First of all, let's talk about the leaves. I showed you how to identify the leaves, and the leaves are edible. They make a great salad green. Again, you could cook them up or put them in stews or use it any way you would use a regular vegetable. And they're really good. The flowers are also edible. You could just eat them right off the plant. You could use them as a nice colorful garnish. Again, you could put them in muffins or pancakes or add them to any kind of salad to make it look really pretty and give it some nutrition. You know, way back in the late 60s and early 70s, there was this guy named Euell Gibbons, and he's kind of the pioneer of bringing out wild edibles to the public, and he's written several books. But one of the things he did that nobody else did before him is he actually took these plants, these wild edibles, he brought them into a laboratory and he got them analyzed. And in his books he lists the vitamins and minerals that you'll find in these plants. There's so many vitamins and minerals in violet leaves, if you eat just a handful of violet leaves a day, it's like taking a vitamin pill. So he calls violets nature's vitamin pill. Now there's lots of different kinds of violets. There are some white ones, there are some purple ones, there are purple and white ones together, there are yellow looking ones. I like to stick, when I teach people about violets, I like to stick to the purple violets because you can't go wrong. All purple violets are edible. So another plant that you may be familiar with are pansies. Now again, most people buy pansies in the store, so you need to be careful, but pansies are actually edible also because they are, in the Viola genus. So violets are really good for you, and what we're going to do is I'm going to collect a bunch of violet flowers and a bunch of leaves. We're going to add them to our salad, and I'm going to show you a couple of really interesting things that you can do with violet flowers that you may not have thought of. Now this next plant on our list has a lot of very distinguishing characteristics to help you identify it. It's pretty common in transition zones and underneath trees and bushes. I've never seen it out in full sun, so it does like a little bit of shade. That's one place to look for it. So this plant is called cleavers, and it's part of the bedstraw family. And there are two plants in North Carolina you'll find like this that I've seen. It's called, this is cleavers, and the other one is just plain bedstraw. So if you look at this plant head on, you can see that the leaves are in what's called a whorl around the stem. And that's pretty common in the bedstraw family. So this plant is edible, the aerial parts, which are the leaves and the stems. But the real fun part about this plant is when I used to teach kids, I used to explain to them that you could collect a bunch of this stuff, stick it to your shirt, and as you're walking down the trail and you get hungry, you just take it off and you nibble on it. When you're done, you can put back the rest. So that's where it gets its name from, cleavers. It cleaves on or grabs onto things. Now our next wild edible is a pretty common plant, and it's one of those plants that it's kind of easy to identify. And what happens is you accidentally rub against it and you know where it got its name from. Now stinging nettle gets its name from the stinging hairs that you find on the leaves and the stems. So you need to be really careful. If you go to harvest this plant, it's a good idea to wear gloves. Now you might be thinking to yourself, why would I want to pick a plant that'll sting me? Well, it turns out that stinging nettle is a really, really nutritious vegetable. And the best part about it is when you take the leaves and you dry them, or you cook them, it takes away the sting. And then all you have left is a really nutritious, really delicious green vegetable. Now, there are ways to eat this raw, and one of the things you do is if you pick it and you rub it in your hands or you rub it against your leg on your clothes, that activates all the stinging hairs. Then you can just take it and eat it raw the way it is, and it actually has a really delicious flavor. So this is the perfect time of the year to collect stinging nettles. The young succulent tops is all you'll take. You can, like I said, you can dry them and grind them up and use them as tea over the winter time or whenever you want. Or you could saute them up and you can use them as a vegetable or put them in soups and stews. What will happen is when the summer it starts to get really hot, these will get really tall, they'll get tough, they'll turn to seed. But in the fall what I do is I cut them back and the new succulent growth starts to come up again. And it just so happens that that's the same time of the year that the sweet potatoes are ready. So I make this really awesome stinging nettle sweet potato soup. So if you get a chance and you find yourself a patch of nettles, again, make sure it's a safe place to collect. I highly recommend that you try this really great wild edible. I have no doubt that most of you recognize this next tree, and this is a pine tree. So before we get started, let's make sure everybody understands what a pine tree is. Now a pine tree is a conifer, but not all conifers are pine trees. So the way you identify pine trees are the needles. Now when I talk about the needles of a pine tree, I'm actually talking about the leaves. And the leaves are needle shaped, and what's unique about pine trees are the needles or the leaves are actually in bundles. And the bundles are held together with a paper-like sheath at the base. Now the length of the leaves and the number of leaves or needles in the bunch can help you identify the pine tree. So make sure that you identify your plant correctly when using it, because there are some toxic plants that are in the conifer family, and there are also some toxic plants that I've seen people call pine. So make sure you actually have a pine tree when you're working with it. Now, there are so many parts of a pine tree that are useful and edible, but because it's spring, we're going to focus on one single part. And most of you are probably going to think I'm crazy, because this is the time of the year that most people hate pine trees, because that green dust that you find on your car and on your house and everything, that's actually the part we're after. Because pine pollen is actually edible and it's extremely nutritious. Now the pine cones that most people recognize on a pine tree are actually the female pine cones. But the cones that we're interested in are actually the male cones. The male cones are the ones that produce the pollen. So these are the male pine cones, and the way you collect these is you basically just take one and twist it and it pops right off. Now this tree, the male cones are not actually ripe, which means they're not exuding pollen at the moment. If they were, if I just touched this, there'd be a puff of green. So this is the perfect time of the year to actually just take these and eat these just the way they are. And they're actually really delicious. You can collect a bunch of these and you could cook them up and you could put them in soups and stews and saute them up and put them with rice or whatever. And they're really delicious. But what we're really after is the pollen. So I found another pine tree where the male cones are actually ready. And you'll see that when you touch them, they exude the green pollen. And that's the stuff we're after. So if you want to know if the pine tree that you have is ready to collect, all you have to do is touch those and the powder comes out. What I'm going to do is I'm going to collect a bunch of these, and again all you do is you take them and you twist them and they pop off. And I'm going to stick these in a bowl and then I'm going to extract the pollen. After going to several pine trees, I got a pretty good supply of male cones. And what we're going to do now is we're going to try to extract the pollen. So what I'm going to try to do is separate the pollen from the male cones. And probably the easiest way to do this is just through a regular kitchen strainer. And I have a big bowl that's going to collect most of the pollen, hopefully. It's a little breezy today, so some of it may go away, but we'll see how it goes. Now I don't want to rough it up too much because I don't want the pollen to go in the air. I do want it to go down through the strainer. Alright, I think that's pretty much the best I'm going to do for now. So I'm going to put this aside, and you take a look at all the pollen that's in the bottom of this bowl. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this pollen and put it into a jar. For storage. You definitely don't want the pollen to get moist, so it's a good idea to store it in something that's not going to allow it to get moist, like a glass jar. And this canning funnel is really helpful because it has a wide mouth. So there we have it. We have a good amount of pollen in here. And this could be added to breads, it could be added to pancakes or muffins to give them a little extra nutrition. You could add it to your drinks in the morning, like a smoothie or a shake or whatever it is that you do. I do have one caution. If you have inhalant allergies to pollen, you might want to test this out to make sure that it doesn't cause you any problems. I remember eating some flowers a long time ago, and I could actually felt that my throat was getting itchy from the pollen, so I don't eat those flowers anymore. So it's a good thing to test before you do. So give it a try, see what you could come up with, and use this for baking. Hopefully, after doing this, you won't hate that pollen all over your car so much in the springtime anymore. Have fun. The sweet smell from all these flowers was just mesmerizing, being in this grove. Not to mention how beautiful the flowers are, not just as a group, but individually. Now, this is very important. You nearly need to hear this. Every part of the plant, except for the flowers, are very toxic. So make sure you only pick the flowers. Don't pick any stems, don't pick any branches, don't pick any leaves. You know, the roots, the vine, the whole thing is toxic, except for the flowers. I collected a bunch of flowers, and these are what we're going to use. I actually waited a little too long, and some of the flowers already started drying up. But there's still enough on here that we can actually use. So remember, we're after just the flowers. When you pull the flowers off, a lot of times this little stem is left behind. I've heard it's a good idea to take that off also. So we're going to take just the succulent flowers and we're going to put them in a jar. Now, I'm not always as careful as I should be about this, but I want to try to get just the flowers. And I'm not going to let you watch me do this whole thing, but you get the idea. Pull the little stems off. And let me get this done and we'll come right back. So the process for making wisteria water is really very simple. You get as many flowers in a jar as you possibly can. Now, I usually like to get more flowers than this, but like I said, I waited a little too long and it was kind of tough collecting a good supply. So you put enough water in there to just about fill up the jar. You put a cover on it and you stick it in the refrigerator. I like to put my floral water in the refrigerator, especially if it's warm out. You don't want the flowers to start decomposing. You want them to infuse their scent into the water. So I previously made some floral water with the wisteria flowers. I strained out the flowers, and you can see it doesn't really have much color to it, but all you have to do is open the top and smell it, and it smells just like the wisteria flowers, and it tastes flowery. It tastes a little bit sweet. It has that flowery taste to it, and it's a good drink to have. Just keep in mind that most of the plant is toxic, and you're only after the flowers. So here's the next plant that I want to show you, and this plant is called wood sorrel. Now, if you look at the leaves, a lot of people make the mistake and think that this is clover. This is not clover, and I'm going to show you the difference between the two. So for me, the easiest way to tell the difference between clover and wood sorrel, this is clover on this side, right here on the left, and this is wood sorrel on the right. If you notice that the leaflets of the wood sorrel are heart-shaped, and the leaflets of the clover are not. Clover is also usually darker in color. So this plant, all the aerial parts, the parts above the ground, are edible. And they have a very tangy, sour taste to them. And I always remember when I used to teach kids about wild edibles, this was one of their favorite plants because they said it tasted like a sweet tart. So this next plant that I want to show you is called sheep sorrel. It's related to the wood sorrel, but the leaves are a lot different. Probably the easiest way to identify this plant is the leaves are shaped like an arrowhead, and they have these two little wings on each side. This plant could be used the same way that the wood sorrel is used. It could be used eaten raw. It could be put in salads. I've actually collected a whole bunch of this in the past and made a French sorrel soup. And this has a nice tang, and it's kind of sour, just like the wood sorrel. It's a really delicious addition to any salad, or really any kind of meal. So give this one a try. So throughout this video, I've been talking about making a salad with all the wild edibles that we found. And that's what we're going to do right now. But actually, before we get started, I have an interesting thing that I want to show you. I don't know if you remember, I mentioned when I was talking about the the violet flowers, that I had something interesting I wanted to show you. I'm going to do that first. So I have 2 mugs here, and I'm using glass for a specific reason. You'll see it a little bit. I'm actually going to take a handful of lavender flowers and put about the same amount in each one. Save a little for the salad. Then I'm going to pour hot water and while we're making the salad, I'm going to let that steep. So throughout this video, I've been explaining how I was going to get together all these wild edibles that we talked about and make a salad. And we're going to work at that right now. What I want to do is I want to show you the ingredients that we're going to use first. So our first ingredient is chickweed. And if you remember when I talked about chickweed, I said how it's a really good base for a salad. Now, you'll almost never find a wild edible growing by itself without any other plants around it. So when you do harvest, you have to go through and make sure you pick out all the plants that are not the ones that you want. And I'm going to do that before I throw this in the salad. The next ingredient are the violet leaves. And we talked about how nutritious these were and how high in vitamins. These are tulip petals. We're going to cut those up and put them in the salad for color and for nutrition. Redbud flowers from the redbud tree. So next we have the leftover violet flowers. We have some succulent tops from the purple dead nettle. And I just went and grabbed a couple of dandelion flowers. So let's get started making this salad. Alright, so to start off with, I'm going to take the chickweed and I'm going to get rid of a lot of the stems and just keep the nice succulent tops. If I have long stems, I'm going to take those off. Take the leaves. Now you don't need to watch me go through this whole bowl, you just basically get the idea. Like this one right here, it's kind of stemmy, so I'm just going to take the tops off and grab the leaves. And some of this, I mean, these are edible, certainly, but they could be a little stringy in a salad, and that's the reason I'm going to take them out. So I think I did a pretty good job of getting the big stems out. So like I said, we're going to make this as the base of our salad. I'm going to fill up the bowl. Oops, I missed a piece of cedar. Oop, there's a couple that got away from me here. A couple of these are already blooming, they're in flower. So the next thing I want to do is I want to add some of these violet leaves. And they're a little big, so I'm just going to cut these up a little bit. Some purple dead nettle. Not only adding nutrition, but a little bit of color to the salad. Redbud flowers. Violet flowers. Now the dandelion flowers, a lot of people don't like bitter things. So what you can do is you actually take the yellow part of the flower and pull it away from the green part, which is the bitter part. And you could add this. You can add this to your salad. And you know the old saying, people eat with their eyes first. So try to make it as artistic as you can. How about we put one right in the center there, just like that. Now most of these petals I'm going to cut up, but I'm going to leave a couple of them whole. Let's pull this out of the way. So I'm just going to slice these. Just do a little sprinkle around the salad. And we could use these as a garnish. Take this one here. Put that one in. Well, it looks like I have an extra one. I better just eat it. Alright guys, so there's our wild edible salad. Now, even if you're not much of a salad eater, you got to admit that's pretty. And you serve this to your guests, they'll be very impressed. The best part about this, it was completely free. I went out on the landscape and gathered all this. This is 100% wild edible salad. Alright, so let's get back to our violet drink. So, right now I think they've been steeping long enough, the violet flowers. And at this point, they look kind of mushy and gushy. They don't really look so great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to strain them out of the drink, because they don't look very appetizing. So I added this white background so you could see the color a little bit better. And I'm just going to try to pour equal amounts into each glass. And you can see that it has sort of a bluish purplish color. Now just the way this is, it's a really good drink. You could add honey to it, you could put ice in it, you could drink it cold, you could drink it hot, whichever way you like. And it's nutritious. But here's a really interesting thing. It turns out that certain plants, including violet flowers, are pH indicators, which means when you put something acidic in it or you put something alkaline in it, it will change colors. So I'm going to add a little lemon to this one. And against the white background, you could really see the difference on how it changed. Now this is a really cool pinkish color. Now to me, this pink one looks a lot like pink lemonade. And I happen to like sour things, so I like the one with the lemon in it better. And I'm just going to add a little bit of, just a half a teaspoon of honey. And stir it around and get that dissolved. And since it's a warm day, I think I'll add a little bit of ice. And there you have it. A completely wild violet flower drink. That's really good. I hope you get a chance to try this at home. Well, after all that hard work of gathering and cleaning and getting things together, now's the best part. Now I get to eat my lunch. And I hope you guys get a chance to try this at home. And 100% wild edible salad, a nice wild edible drink, and a homemade vinaigrette. You can't beat this for a lunch. I hope you get a chance to try this at home. Bon appetit. Well guys, I think that's about all the time I have for this video. And I want to say thanks for joining me. And I hope you learned a couple of things that you didn't know before about the wild plants in the springtime. I do want you to keep in mind a couple of things. First of all, the spring is almost 4 months long. And the plants that you'll find in the beginning of the spring, you might not find towards the end of the spring, right before summer. As a matter of fact, it's the end of April, And right now, a lot of the plants that I talked about in this video already passed their peak. So it's a good idea to get outside whenever you can, every day, and learn a little bit about the plants around you. Because as the seasons progress, things will change. New plants are coming up now. There'll be plants in the summer that are available, and of course the autumn and the winter and so on. So get out there and spend some time in the sun, exploring nature, and just keep in mind the safety points, okay? Thank you.